It's actually pretty striking. Just last year, something like 8 million people in the US used psilocybin.
Wow, 8 million.
Yeah, the stuff in magic mushrooms. And get this, half of them. They were microdosing. It really shows how these things are moving into the mainstream, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And, well, it really highlights why taking a deeper look at hallucinogens, things like ayahuasca and psilocybin, feels so important right now.
Mhm.
Humans have a really long history with these substances, using them to alter consciousness across so many cultures.
Absolutely. So look, whether you're curious, maybe a bit skeptical, or, somewhere in between about people using them, the reality is they're part of the conversation now.
Hmm.
And what we want to do today is really get into the nuts and bolts. How do they actually work? What are the potential uses being studied? And this is crucial, who really should probably steer clear.
Right. We've kind of waded through a huge amount of information, everything from ancient practices to the latest studies looking at positive effects to try and pull out the really key stuff for you.
Yeah, our goal isn't just to skate over the surface. We want to get under the hood, understand the mechanisms. Think of this as like your shortcut to grasping the essentials, moving beyond just the descriptions.
A good way to put it.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. When we talk about these traditional hallucinogens, most of them work through molecules from the tryptamine family.
That's right, tryptamines. And a really central molecule there is DMT, dimethyltryptamine. What's kind of amazing is that DMT isn't just in plants, it's in animals. And even in us, in humans, though admittedly in much smaller amounts.
Yeah, our own bodies make it. There's that whole popular idea about the pineal gland, right? Though the science isn't totally solid on that yet.
Mm-hmm. It's often linked, but definitive proof is tricky. But yeah, the levels we produce naturally are tiny compared to what you'd find in, say, the plants used in an ayahuasca brew.
Right.
And DMT, like a lot of these tryptamines, it's actually made from the amino acid tryptophan.
Tryptophan.
Yeah.
Like in turkey, the stuff that supposedly makes you sleepy.
Exactly that one. It's the building block your body uses to make serotonin too.
Ah, okay. Which connects to another key point, right? All these hallucinogens we're looking at, they work by messing with serotonin receptors in the brain.
Precisely. They interact with those serotonin pathways.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because serotonin is usually linked with things like sleep, melatonin production,
Uh-huh.
which might, give us a clue why lots of traditional DMT rituals happen in the dark.
Huh. Makes sense. Okay, so DMT on its own, what's that experience like?
Well, typically when it's used alone, the DMT experience is described as intensely visual. People often report things like encountering distinct entities, visiting other dimensions, sometimes even having experiences that feel like near-death scenarios. Very vivid, very
But
powerful.
it doesn't last long, right?
That's a key thing. The body breaks it down incredibly quickly. So the experience, while it can be profound, is usually pretty short-lived, maybe 15, 20 minutes, sometimes less.
Okay, but ayahuasca is different because that involves mixing plants together.
Exactly. Ayahuasca is a brew. Traditionally combines at least two plants. One is rich in DMT, like Psychotria viridis,
Okay.
and the other is something like Banisteriopsis caapi, which contains MAO inhibitors, MAOs.
MAO inhibitors,
Yeah.
IONIOs. Okay, so what do they do in the mix?
Think of them as like protectors for the DMT. They basically stop your body's enzymes, the MAO enzymes, from breaking down the DMT so fast.
Ah,
So the crucial bit is these inhibitors allow the DMT in ayahuasca to stick around much, much longer when you drink it.
right. So that's why ayahuasca lasts for hours, unlike just inhaling or injecting DMT. Makes total sense.
That's the key difference for oral use, yeah.
Yeah.
And it means the dosage is different too. Inhaled or injected DMT might be, say, 10 to 40 milligrams.
Nah.
But orally, in ayahuasca, you're looking at maybe 10, sometimes up to 150 milligrams, so that's a hefty dose.
And it takes longer to feel it when you drink it.
Yeah, definitely, because it has to be absorbed through your digestive system into the bloodstream. So usually you're looking at maybe 30, 45 minutes before it starts to kick in.
Yeah.
And that can vary based on the dose, your own body, if you've eaten recently, all those factors.
Okay. Got the molecule basics down. Now, let's zoom out a bit. What's actually happening in the brain during these altered states of consciousness?
Right, this is where it gets really fascinating. Researchers often look at these altered states through 5 main lenses, 5 key areas. The first is a reduction of vigilance.
Reduction of vigilance, so less alert.
Yeah, exactly. Your alertness kind of dips, and your sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response, chills out a bit. This is likely tied to those serotonin effects we mentioned. People tend to feel more sedated, less on edge.
Which really underscores why having a sober guide is so important, right? If you're not fully alert.
Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Then the second area is sensory alterations. This is mainly about sound and sight.
Hallucin.
Well, yeah, or alterations. For hearing, sounds might seem way louder, or you might hear things that aren't their auditory hallucinations, or maybe just distortions of real sounds.
And these aren't triggered by anything real outside you.
Exactly. It's all happening because of changes in the brain's own electrical activity.
Mm.
That usual filtering mechanism seems to get disrupted, which is probably why senses feel so amplified. It's why you can have these visuals or sounds even with your eyes shut or in complete silence. It's internal.
Wow. Okay, what's number 3?
The third one covers experiences related to what's often termed ego dissolution.
Ego dissolution, losing your sense of self.
Kind of. It's more like feeling your personal self-importance shrink and instead feeling this deep connection or unity with something bigger. Nature, humanity, God, the universe, whatever resonates. It's a common theme.
That temporary blurring of the self.
Yeah, and it can lead to these really profound shifts in perspective, feeling interconnected. We can touch on the brain areas involved later.
Okay. And the fourth area?
Fourth is about longer-term beneficial changes, sometimes called restructuring. Even if you know nothing about hallucinogens, you probably associate them with, seeing weird stuff.
Right, like floating through space or meeting aliens.
Or maybe encountering deceased relatives. It's interesting, the word ayahuasca in Quechua actually translates to something like vine of the spirits, hints at those kinds of experiences.
So how does seeing things that aren't technically real lead to actual benefits? That seems counterintuitive.
Well, the idea is that these intense, novel experiences can actually help form new connections in the brain neuroplasticity. They can offer a completely new way of looking at things, or maybe help therapeutically reframe existing perceptions and memories. It's like
Yeah.
rewiring how you see things, literally and figuratively.
That's pretty profound. Okay, and the fifth area?
The fifth one is called oceanic boundlessness. It's a bit newer as a concept, maybe.
Oceanic boundlessness.
Yeah, it describes that feeling or perception of yourself without clear limits,
Yeah.
like you're expanding outwards, like an ocean. Basically, the feeling that limitations are dissolving away. Your personal worries, your identity, they kind of fade, and you feel part of something vast.
Okay, so those are the big mental shifts. What about physically? What does the body go through?
Right, it's important to separate the mental journey from the physical effects, though they're linked.
Mm-hmm.
Physically, people might experience a faster heartbeat, tachycardia, dizziness. Their pupils might dilate, sometimes agitation, paranoia. We'll talk about handling that later, maybe some involuntary eye movements.
And I've heard about nausea.
Oh, yeah. Diarrhea and vomiting are pretty common, especially with ayahuasca. Not exactly pleasant physically.
Doesn't sound like it.
And the thinking is that a lot of the mental stuff is actually tied to changes in blood flow in specific brain areas, like the frontal and paralimbic regions. So there's a real physiological underpinning. And just circling back quickly to DMT when it's injected or inhaled, remember, very short duration, and it doesn't typically lead to dependence. That short action actually makes it useful for researchers.
Right. Easier to study.
Whereas the oral DMT and ayahuasca, as we said, much longer lasting because of those MAO inhibitors.
Got it. Okay, so we've gone from molecules to brain regions. Let's zoom in even more, down to the cellular level. What's happening with the actual neurons?
This is where some really cool research is happening, especially in animal models. Studies in mice have shown that DMT can actually stimulate the creation of new neurons, neurogenesis, specifically in the hippocampus.
New brain cells in the hippocampus, which is key for memory and learning.
Exactly. That's a pretty big deal.
So new neuron growth in mice. How much do we know if that happens in humans, and what could that mean long term?
Well, translating directly from mice to humans always needs caution, but it's definitely suggestive. And it's not just new cells. DMT also seems to encourage neural rewiring, plasticity. It helps the brain make new connections, form new networks.
Ah, plasticity.
And that might be a big part of why ayahuasca's effects can feel like they last long after the drug is worn off. It's potentially down to these lasting changes in brain structure and function.
So how does making new connections help with things like trauma or changing behaviors?
Think about memory. Our current understanding is that a memory is basically a specific pattern of neurons firing in a particular sequence.
Like a pathway lighting up.
Right. And recalling the memory means activating that pathway again. Like when you practice a skill, then sleep on it, Your brain replays those patterns.
Okay.
Now, hallucinogens seem to turbocharge this plasticity compared to, say, just exercising or reading. The chemical hit is potent enough that new connections can form much faster than through, well, meditation, for example.
So these new connections, they actually change how the brain works.
That's the idea. They modify the electrical signals.
Yeah.
This could potentially lessen the emotional punch of negative memories or create alternative pathways to bypass old unhelpful behaviors. It opens up possibilities for change at a fundamental level.
Really fascinating. Okay, shifting gears slightly. You mentioned earlier these substances are getting popular partly because studies show positive effects, especially on mood.
Absolutely. The research, especially in the last decade or so, has really highlighted potential upsides, particularly around mood. Some studies, for instance, have shown pretty clear improvements in depression symptoms within just the first couple of weeks after DMT use, specifically in people diagnosed with depression.
That sounds incredibly promising. But you mentioned a catch earlier about how the DMT was given in those studies.
Yes, that's a crucial detail. A lot of the studies showing really strong positive effects use intravenous DMT.
Ah, not drinking ayahuasca.
Right, which isn't how most people consume it traditionally or therapeutically. Now, there is evidence suggesting ayahuasca itself can reduce depression symptoms too, but the volume of research, the amount of data, isn't quite as large yet compared to the intravenous DMT studies. Still emerging.
Okay, so potential benefits, but it's not all sunshine and rainbows. What are the downsides, the precautions people absolutely need to know?
Yes, it's vital to be clear. These aren't risk-free, and they aren't for everyone. There are a couple of serious, though statistically rare, potential negative outcomes. First, many hallucinogens carry a very small risk of triggering something called persistent psychosis.
Persistent psychosis.
Yeah, basically a psychotic state that continues long after the drug should have worn off.
Ah,
We need to be clear, this is very rare.
okay. What else?
A second issue, which is somewhat more common, though still not frequent, is HPPD, hallucinogen persisting perception disorder.
HPPD.
Yeah, this is where someone keeps experiencing some of the perceptual distortions, usually visual, sometimes auditory, long after they've stopped using the substance, like visual snow, trails, halos. It's less rare than full psychosis, but still not common.
And are certain people more at risk for these things?
Definitely. Both persistent psychosis and HPPD are significantly more likely in people who have underlying, perhaps undiagnosed or untreated, mental health issues already. Pre-existing conditions are a major risk factor.
So if someone has a history of mental illness.
They are at much higher risk. With HPPD, it often manifests as flashbacks of the trip, sometimes without the person realizing they aren't real in the moment. It can be quite distressing.
Yeah, that sounds awful. You also mentioned a specific risk with ayahuasca, something about serotonin.
Yes, serotonin syndrome. This is important because it doesn't necessarily require a pre-existing mental illness. It's rare, but it can be dangerous, even life-threatening.
What is it exactly?
It's basically having way too much serotonin activity in your system. Remember how ayahuasca naturally contains MAO inhibitors?
Right, to make the DMT last longer.
Well, if someone is also taking certain other medications, especially some types of antidepressants that also increase serotonin or are MAOIs themselves, combining them with ayahuasca can push serotonin levels into a dangerous zone. It's a serious interaction risk.
Okay, that's critical info. Any other major physical risks linked specifically to ayahuasca?
While extremely rare, there have been occasional reports of deaths associated with ayahuasca use. These seem to be concentrated in areas where consumption is very high, like around Iquitos in Peru. But the exact causes are often complex and not solely attributable to the substance itself. Still, it's something to be aware of.
Now, that fear people have, the going crazy fear, developing psychosis, how real is that concern?
It's an understandable fear. And look, there are documented cases, though rare, of people having psychotic breaks seemingly triggered by these substances. The leading theory right now is that these substances probably don't cause psychosis out of the blue, but they might act as a trigger in someone who already has a predisposition, maybe a genetic vulnerability or a strong family history. But honestly, our understanding here is still limited.
Is there any idea how that might happen? The mechanism?
One hypothesis involves the interaction with certain brain receptors. Some antipsychotic drugs, like risperidone, target specific serotonin receptors. Hallucinogens hit some of the same receptors but seem to have the opposite effect. So it's complex pharmacology.
So the bottom line is?
The bottom line is crystal clear. If you have any personal history or a close family history of psychosis or a serious mental illness, these substances are absolutely contraindicated. The risk just isn't worth it. Avoid them.
That's a very strong warning. Okay, so thinking about risk generally, how should we frame this? Everything has some risk, right?
Yeah, exactly. There's no such thing as zero risk. Going for a run carries a small risk of twisting an ankle.
Sure.
And what's beneficial for one person might be harmful for another. Therapeutic fasting can be great for someone with metabolic issues, but terrible for someone who's pregnant. Context is everything.
So it's about understanding the risks of a specific tool, minimizing them, and knowing who shouldn't use it at all.
Precisely. Understand the risks, figure out how to reduce them, and identify the contraindications. And for hallucinogens, the single most effective harm reduction strategy. Having an experienced, sober guide present, someone who knows the territory but isn't under the influence themselves, who can offer support and guidance.
Makes sense. Now, context is important. You mentioned earlier that compared to some other drugs, these might actually be lower risk.
Yeah, it's important perspective. Many legal and illegal psychoactive substances carry significantly more side effects and overall risks than classic hallucinogens like psilocybin or LSD, even before you factor in potential benefits.
Like alcohol, for instance.
Alcohol is a prime example. On almost any measure of harm to the user, to others, societal cost alcohol ranks extremely high. It's a massive public health issue. If you look at those charts comparing drug harms, alcohol is often right near the top, while psilocybin tends to be way down at the bottom in terms of acute toxicity and dependence potential.
Which is a perfect segue to magic mushrooms and psilocybin specifically. What exactly is psilocybin?
So psilocybin is the main psychoactive compound in those well-known hallucinogenic mushrooms. They've got a really long history, especially in traditional medicine in parts of North and Central America. And structurally, just like DMT, its origins trace back to that amino acid tryptophan.
Right, the serotonin connection again. And you mentioned some really interesting research using it for depression.
Absolutely. There's growing evidence, quite compelling studies actually, using psilocybin combined with psychotherapy for treatment-resistant depression cases where standard antidepressants haven't worked. And the results have often been very positive.
And the FDA is involved now.
Yeah, things are shifting. Since around 2018, 2019, the FDA has granted it breakthrough therapy designation for certain conditions like major depression, which basically fast-tracks research and development. It's not widely available as a prescription yet, but it's moving towards potential approved use in controlled therapeutic settings.
Okay, so what about safety? You said it ranks low on those harm charts.
Safety is definitely one of psilocybin's strong points, relatively speaking. We often look at the LD50 dose lethal to 50% of test animals. For psilocybin in rats, it's incredibly high, something like 10 grams per kilogram of body weight.
10 grams per kilo, that sounds enormous. How does that compare to something common?
Well, it's roughly 1.5 times higher than the LD50 of caffeine in rats.
Wow, so practically speaking, could someone actually overdose on mushrooms?
It's almost practically impossible from eating mushrooms. A common, potent mushroom like psilocybe cubensis has maybe 1% psilocybin by dry weight. To reach that theoretical rat LD50, a person would need to eat over 1.5 kilograms. That's like 3.5 pounds of dried mushrooms.
Okay, nobody's doing that.
Right. The psychoactive effects would be completely overwhelming long before you got anywhere near a physically toxic dose. And crucially, there are no documented human deaths caused solely by psilocybin overdose.
That's good to know, but the LD50 is from rat studies, right? Any caveats there?
Yeah, always important caveats. Animal data doesn't always translate perfectly. Different species have different sensitivities. Rabbits, for instance, seem more sensitive than rats. But the main point is the sheer scale. A typical recreational dose might start around 10 milligrams of pure psilocybin.
Okay.
That's over 100 times less than the estimated lethal dose. Even a so-called heroic dose, like Terence McKenna talked about, maybe 30, 40 milligrams, is still worlds away from toxicity.
And how fast does it work? How long does it last?
Usually starts to come on within maybe 10 to 40 minutes after eating them. The main effects last somewhere between 2 and 6 hours, mostly depending on how fast your liver metabolizes it.
Okay. And like DMT, you said it doesn't really cause dependence.
That's a key feature. Unlike, say, opioids or stimulants or even some anxiety meds, psilocybin isn't considered addictive or dependence-forming. Part of that is likely due to how it works.
How does it work specifically?
Well, when you ingest psilocybin, your body converts it into psilocin. And psilocin mainly acts on one specific type of serotonin receptor, called the 5-HT2A receptor.
Just that one main target, is that significant?
It is, potentially. Many antidepressants, for example, hit multiple serotonin receptor types, which might contribute to a wider range of side effects. Psilocybin's relative specificity for 5-HT2A might mean more targeted effects. And interestingly, these 5-HT2A receptors are highly concentrated in the visual cortex back of the brain, which helps explain why psilocybin trips are often so visually intense, even for people who are blind. The visuals are generated internally.
So the subjective feeling, it's similar to DMT then?
There are overlaps, yeah. Euphoria, feelings of peace, maybe some depersonalization, definitely the visual stuff, sometimes nausea or other physical bits too. But generally, psilocybin's effect on those 5 dimensions of altered consciousness we talked about, it tends to be a bit less intense, maybe less overwhelming than a strong DMT experience.
Right. Okay, let's switch gears to microdosing. That stat at the
Ah.
beginning half of users microdosing is huge. What exactly is it?
Microdosing basically means taking a tiny fraction of a normal recreational dose, usually somewhere between 1/10 and 1/20th.
So small you don't really feel it.
That's the goal. It's meant to be sub-perceptual. You shouldn't feel high or impaired. You should be able to go about your normal day. People often take it in processed forms like chocolates or teas to make the dosing easier.
And how much is that in terms of, like, actual mushrooms?
For dried mushrooms, a microdose is typically in the range of zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.3 grams, so way less than a gram. The actual amount of pure psilocybin in that is very small, just a few milligrams at most.
And I keep hearing about people stacking it, mixing it with other things.
Yeah, that's a trend. Stacking involves combining the psilocybin microdose with other supplements, supposedly to enhance the effects. Common additions are things like lion's mane mushroom, which is a nootropic, or niacin vitamin B3.
Niacin. Why niacin?
Well, the theory, and it is mostly theory, is that niacin might help with NAD plus production for energy, and maybe, possibly, help the psilocybin get absorbed or utilized better. Some people report a flushing effect from niacin, too. It's also used in skin creams, interestingly.
So the goal of stacking is just to boost the microdose effect.
Pretty much, yeah, to try and get more bang for your microbucks, so to speak.
Yeah.
You hear about LSD being used for microdosing, too, but that's a whole other conversation, really.
Okay. So why has microdosing become so popular? What are people hoping to get out of it?
A lot of the buzz comes from anecdotal reports and some early, often less rigorous studies suggesting it might help with things like managing stress, reducing anxiety, maybe lifting mild depression.
Any other areas?
There have also been some interesting, though small, studies looking at psilocybin, both micro and full doses in terminal cancer patients. The findings suggested it might help reduce their anxiety, especially the fear of death. That's a potentially really valuable application, helping people face the end of life with more peace.
That's powerful. But the evidence isn't all positive, is it? There's skepticism, too.
Oh, definitely. It's really important to note that for every anecdotal report or preliminary study suggesting benefits, there are other, often better controlled studies that haven't found consistent improvement in mood or cognition with microdosing compared to placebo.
Why the difference?
A lot of it likely comes down to methodology. Many early studies relied heavily on subjective questionnaires. People expecting to feel better can influence results. The placebo effect is strong. Suggestibility plays a role. That kind of self-reported data just isn't as reliable as objective measures. So the scientific jury is still very much out on microdosing's effectiveness.
Right. So thinking about how it works again, how would a tiny microdose affect the brain differently from a full psychedelic dose?
It's helpful to use an analogy. If you know a sharp knife cuts things, you can predict that swinging it around wildly is probably riskier than using it carefully. Similarly, knowing the basics of how these drugs work helps us think about different doses.
Okay.
So we know full doses work heavily through serotonin, particularly 5-HT2A receptors. Serotonin generally has a calming effect, increasing parasympathetic activity, the rest and digest system.
Right. But if high doses cause big serotonin changes, why don't they always make people feel super focused or happy? Sometimes it's the opposite, right?
Exactly. Big, widespread serotonin surges often lead to feeling less sharp, more relaxed, maybe even sedated, not necessarily cognitively enhanced. So the theory with microdosing is that the much smaller, subtler nudge to the serotonin system might reduce anxiety or stress via that gentle parasympathetic boost, but without causing the significant cognitive fuzziness or intense alterations of a full dose.
But could that subtle relaxation have downsides?
It's possible. Maybe that slight reduction in edge could, in some situations, negatively impact sharp decision-making or complex reasoning. It's speculative, but plausible. On the flip side, maybe this altered state, even subtly, contributes to enhanced creativity.
Ah, yeah, the creativity link. That's been around for ages, hasn't it? LSD, mushrooms.
Absolutely. It's a long-standing association. You hear stories about artists, musicians, people sometimes credit psychedelics for creative breakthroughs.
Yeah.
Think about the evolution of bands like the Beatles. Some people link that to their experiences.
And not just arts, right. You mentioned a scientist.
Yeah, Kerry Mullis. He won the Nobel Prize for inventing PCR, that crucial DNA copying technique used for everything from COVID tests to forensics. He explicitly credited insights gained during psychedelic experiences for helping him crack the problem.
Wow. So why might they boost creativity? What's happening in the brain networks?
That's the million-dollar question in neuroscience is exploring. It seems related to how these substances affect large-scale brain networks, particularly the resting state networks that are active when we're not focused on a specific external task.
Resting state networks?
Yeah, think of them as coalitions of brain regions that work together for general processes, like the network involved when you hear your name called and turn your head, lots of regions coordinating.
Okay. Which networks are key for creativity?
3 seem particularly important. First, the default mode network, DMN, involved in internal thought, daydreaming, generating ideas. Second, the frontoparietal control network, which kind of evaluates those ideas, checks them against reality plans, sort of, yeah. And third, the salience network, which helps us notice and orient to important things, either internal or external, like shifting focus if there's a loud bang versus tuning out background noise.
So how do psychedelics change how these networks operate?
Well, one prominent theory suggests creative thinking involves switching flexibly between that internal idea-generating DMN state and the more evaluative, externally aware states involving the control and salience networks. Psychedelics seem to disrupt the normal, somewhat rigid boundaries between these networks.
To make the brain more fluid.
Exactly. Less siloed, more interconnected, more flexible. The usual patterns of network activity get temporarily shaken up.
And that increased flexibility, how does that relate to mental health, like rigid thinking?
That's where it gets really interesting. This enhanced flexibility might be why psilocybin shows promise not just for creativity, but for conditions characterized by rigid thought patterns like depression, where people get stuck in negative loops, or OCD with its repetitive compulsions.
It helps break those patterns.
Potentially, yes. Similar to what we discussed with DMT and ayahuasca's restructuring effect, it allows for new perspectives, new connections to form. When combined with therapy, it can help people see old problems in a new light and integrate those insights. It literally seems to make the brain's connections more pliable for a time.
Which might also explain the results in addiction treatment you mentioned.
Precisely. That smoking cessation study where half the participants quit after one psilocybin session plus therapy, that's remarkable.
Yeah.
It's likely not targeting the chemical addiction directly, but rather helping to rewire the ingrained behavioral patterns and neural networks associated with the addiction, making it easier to choose a different path, reducing the rigidity of the addictive behavior.
Incredible potential there. Okay, quickly, you mentioned hallucinogenic toads earlier too, another source of DMT.
Yeah, certain toad species, like the Sonoran desert toad, produce venom containing DMT and other compounds, notably 5-MeO-DMT, which is related but distinct. This venom comes from glands on their skin.
And the effects are similar.
Very similar psychoactive effects to DMT, ayahuasca, psilocybin, yeah. Intense, short-acting when smoked. There's a lot of anecdotal buzz around it, people reporting reduced depression, anxiety, stress, increased life satisfaction, sometimes after just one use, lasting for months.
But again, mostly anecdotal.
Mostly anecdotal, often questionnaire-based, so interpret with caution. However, there is some more concrete biological research emerging. Studies have shown changes in inflammatory markers in humans after using toad venom, specifically reductions in pro-inflammatory cytokines like IL-6 and TNF-alpha.
So a potential anti-inflammatory effect?
Possibly. It suggests physiological effects beyond just the trip itself. More research is needed, of course.
Okay. So whether it's DMT, psilocybin, toad venom, it sounds like the actual experience can vary hugely. It's not guaranteed to be the same each time or for each person.
That is absolutely fundamental to understand. The exact same dose of, say, psilocybin can have wildly different effects depending on the person and even on the same person on different days. It all comes down to set and setting.
Set and setting. Can you break that down?
Sure. Set is your internal state, your mindset, your mood, your expectations, your intentions, your mental and emotional state going into it.
Okay.
And setting is the external environment. Where are you? Who are you with? Is it safe, comfortable, chaotic? The physical and social context.
And if your set or setting is bad, that's when you risk a bad trip.
Exactly. If you go in feeling anxious, stressed, or fearful, or if you're in an environment that feels unsafe or overwhelming, the chances of a negative, paranoid, or difficult experience skyrocket.
Is there a physiological reason for that?
Yeah, it ties back to stress hormones. Many hallucinogens can increase cortisol. If you're already stressed, high cortisol, taking the substance can push it higher. This can overactivate brain regions like the amygdala, which is involved in fear and threat detection. That distorted perception is fertile ground for a bad trip.
Does having used them before help?
Generally, yes. Studies suggest people with more experience tend to navigate the experiences more positively. They kind of know what to expect, how to handle the weirdness.
And the group size matters too. You mentioned paranoia.
Right. Research indicates that taking these substances in large groups, say 8 or more people, tends to increase feelings of paranoia, probably linked to suggestibility.
Suggestibility, how does that work?
Hallucinogens seem to increase suggestibility. You become more open, more influenced by your environment, by sensory input, by other people's vibes. In a big group, there's just more potential for negative input, someone else having a bad time, which can then trigger anxiety and paranoia in others. It's a contagion effect, potentially amplified by the substance.
So if someone does start feeling things go south during a trip, what's the advice?
Experts often advise not to fight the feeling. Trying to resist or suppress difficult sensations like feeling you're dying or losing control often backfires, increasing anxiety, heart rate, cortisol.
So what should you do?
The recommendation is usually to try and observe it with curiosity. Acknowledge it's happening, remind yourself it's the drug effect, and that it's temporary. Treat it almost like a meditation object. Notice it without struggling against it. Easier said than done, of course.
And sometimes difficult emotions or memories come up.
Yes, definitely. The altered perception can absolutely bring suppressed stuff to the surface, difficult life aspects, past traumas. That's why integration is so key.
Integration, meaning?
Meaning having someone to talk to afterwards, processing what came up, making sense of it. It's why combining psilocybin with psychotherapy is showing such promise for depression. The therapy provides the container for integration. But really, that principal mindset and environment matter hugely for positive experiences. That applies to everyone in all aspects of life, not just when using these substances, right?
Absolutely. A good mindset and environment are key, period. Okay, let's dive a bit deeper into this altered consciousness itself. What makes it so impactful? You said single uses can have lasting effects.
It's one of the most remarkable things about this class of drugs. We consistently hear stories and see preliminary data suggesting that even a single experience can sometimes lead to profound, enduring changes in perspective or behavior. It's pretty unique.
And that comes from
Likely a combination of those brain changes we talked about, the network shifts, the neuroplasticity, and the subjective quality of the altered consciousness itself, those 5 dimensions.
right. And that idea of a higher state of consciousness, is that scientifically valid?
Higher state is tricky language scientifically. It's value-laden. But let's revisit those dimensions. Reduced vigilance, sensory alterations, ego dissolution, restructuring, oceanic boundlessness. DMT and psilocybin really emphasize the sensory changes and the restructuring. While the ego dissolution and oceanic boundlessness often lead to what people describe as mystical experiences, losing the self, feeling unity, infinity.
So maybe not higher, but definitely different. Wider, maybe.
Wider or different bandwidth is a common description. Like more sensory information is getting through the brain's usual filters and demanding attention. There's even a test that supports this idea, pre-pulse inhibition or PPI. Normally, if you get a small warning stimulus, a pre-pulse, just before a big startling stimulus, your startle response to the big one is reduced. Your brain filters it a bit. Psychedelics disrupt this PPI. The pre-pulse doesn't dampen the startle as much.
Suggesting the filters are down?
Exactly. More sensory data flooding in. But crucially, while sensory perception might be up, cognitive functions like attention and memory are often down. So higher consciousness overall. Probably not accurate. It's a trade-off.
And what about time and space perception? People report weird things there.
Oh yeah, classic effects. Time slowing down, stopping entirely, past and future feeling like they're merging, the sense of boundaries between self and environment dissolving. That's oceanic boundlessness again. Even out-of-body experiences, sometimes termed astral travel. Very common subjective reports.
It really does bend the mind. Which leads to the big question. Can we get to similar places, achieve these kinds of states, without the drugs? Naturally.
That's the golden question, isn't it? And yeah, as we said, our bodies make DMT. It acts like a neurotransmitter. Now, there's that persistent myth connecting it mainly to the pineal gland, the third eye.
Right, you hear that a lot.
And you can see why the idea took hold. The pineal gland makes melatonin, related to serotonin and tryptophan, and DMT enhances perception. So metaphorically, third eye makes intuitive sense.
But the science doesn't really back up the pineal gland as the main DMT factory, or that psychedelics specifically target it?
Correct. There's no strong evidence for that specific link. Neuroimaging shows widespread brain changes with psychedelics, not just focused pineal activity. But to your core question, can we achieve similar states naturally? Yes, to some degree, by influencing brain activity.
How? Where?
Well, mystical experiences which overlap with psychedelic states are strongly linked to increased theta brainwave oscillations.
Theta waves.
Yeah.
Like the brain's electrical rhythm.
Exactly. Measured in cycles per second, hertz. More theta activity during psychedelic trips often correlates with stronger mystical feelings. And one reliable way to boost theta naturally, meditation. Especially deep meditation with minimal external distraction.
Focusing inwards.
Right. It tends to increase theta and quiet down other networks. Think about monks meditating for days in dark, quiet places. That's historically been a path towards altered states.
What about things like binaural beats? Do they help?
Binaural beats use headphones to play slightly different frequencies in each ear. The brain perceives the difference as a third tone, and this can theoretically help entrain brain waves to a desired frequency, like theta, around 40 hertz.
Interesting.
Theta activity also naturally increases right as you're falling asleep before you hit the deeper delta waves of sleep. That's also when lucid dreaming can happen.
So maybe meditating deeply in the dark, maybe with binaural beats, especially around sleep time, that's the best bet naturally.
That combination might be the most effective natural approach to nudging your brain towards similar states.
Yeah.
But, and this is a big but, don't expect it to replicate the sheer intensity of a high-dose psychedelic experience. It likely won't.
And those internet things promising to boost your DMT with breathing exercises.
Mostly bogus. Remember, your body breaks down DMT super fast without MAO inhibitors. You can't just breathe your way to a psychedelic DMT level. It's better to focus on practices proven to enhance theta activity, meditation, rhythmic activities. These can reduce anxiety, offer some similar benefits, support plasticity for change.
But probably won't involve talking to entities?
Probably not, no. Even extensive meditation usually doesn't produce reports quite like high-dose psychedelic experiences. Though maybe future tech, like targeted neurofeedback or brain stimulation, could offer non-drug ways to access specific states more reliably. That's still speculative, though.
That was incredibly thorough. Thank you so much for breaking down such a complex and, let's face it, often controversial topic.
My pleasure. It's a rapidly evolving field, and understanding the basics is key, whether you're curious, concerned, or just trying to make sense of the changing landscape.
Absolutely. And just one final, very important note for everyone listening. The information we've discussed here today is purely for educational purposes. It is absolutely not advice or encouragement to use any substances. Please make informed decisions based on credible sources and professional guidance if needed.
Well said.
If you found this deep dive useful or interesting, maybe subscribe, give us a like, or share it with someone else who might benefit. We'll definitely be back soon with more deep dives into fascinating topics.